The game is Geronimo. It's a game that hasn't gotten a lot of love, never really did. I think it sits in an interesting position where the game mechanics feel kind of gamey in the sense that, well, like something like History of the World, you're playing different people at different times. You have even less association with who you're playing. So let's say you're playing the 5-player game, which I think is what I'm going to do. I may drop down to 4. 4 of the players are playing native tribes, and 1 is playing the U.S. player. And that's on each turn, and it's randomly determined. The U.S. player gets the U.S. forces, and his goal is to spread white man civilization and wipe out Indians and all that great stuff. The Indian players are seeking to gain points through a number of ways, mainly through destructive action against the encroaching whites. The U.S., if he fails to maintain his statehood, can take penalties in whatever states are created. Likewise, the Indian players, if their tribes are wiped out, they pay a penalty. Sending tribes on reservation is a bonus for the U.S. player. Not necessarily so much for the Indian players, although it can prevent them from losing points due to the death of a tribe. Anyway, the problem is what you do with your tribe. There's no building in the game. You're just looking for points. So there's no reason to try to build up your forces. If you build up the U.S. forces, you may not be playing them the next turn. And you may set someone up for heavy victory points. So kind of the goal is always to maximize your points with what you have right now, and don't worry about the future at all. You might have to worry a little bit in the turn itself. It uses a mechanic system that's very much like the CDGs, except there's no action points with the cards. It comes from a time period when Magic had just come out, and you could say, well, the same thought is in play, but I would say that this actually owes something to the CDG's design. You have to play a card every time you take an action. The card's event takes place unless you choose to discard it. If you choose to discard it, you don't get an action. That's very similar to some of the CDG games, and I think there's a bit of intertwining there in terms of the design ideas. The game plays, though, kind of like, I always looked at it as kind of almost a card game. Not in the sense that there's cards, but in the sense of the scoring. It's like playing a game of hearts, oh hell. You're trying to maximize your points with whatever you have in your hand, the cards you have, the pieces you have at that particular moment. And there's nothing really to work for other than the points that you get in a particular round. The other thing is, at least in the campaign game, and that's what I'm going to play, and that's all I've ever played, so I'm not positive if the basic game is a little bit less unbalanced in this way. There's basically a 1 or 2 turn period where the U.S. player can rack up the points. And then there's the rest of the game. The early part of the game, the Indian players can usually do pretty well. They actually score more points than the U.S. player usually does. Later in the game, the U.S. player scores probably more than the Indian players, but not a lot. Nobody's getting many points at all. There are tipping points. If a U.S. player who was doing well is stopped in a lot of states all at once, and doesn't achieve statehood in them, the next player is guaranteed a lot of points with the U.S., whoever they are. So there has to be kind of this gang up on the leader type ideal behind each turn. And that's very hard to determine at the beginning of the game who the leader is going to be. But as you get midway through the game, you have a pretty good idea who's got the most points. I mean, everybody's aware of it. It's written on the game. So I think the factor of the game being rather having possible unbalances that are very, very luck determinant, as well as the system is not simple. It's not terribly complicated, but, you know, there's without historical and version, it's a 23-page rule book. That's a little heavy for people who are used to the history of the world type game. It's also, at least with the campaign game, a little longer. Runs around 8 hours probably. And 8 hours is a lot to invest in something where maybe 2 turns determine the game. Kind of painful. Most of the game rules on these little cards though, and that can be very helpful. If you have somebody who knows the rules and explains them, these cards are usually enough to understand pretty much everything that's going on. I'm not sure how we're going to pace this, probably with clips here and there as people do exciting things, and then an overview at the end of the turn. All right.